It's always so difficult to follow Joan. I mean, is she just spot on with everything she says? So a big thank you to Joan for putting this together. But also, I think that the most salient point is we're all here for the patients, right? And I think that was summarized so well. So we can all see the title slide for Anuncia Medical. I'd also like to highlight one of our key marketing people, Sophia Di Loren, is here. So if there's any technical questions that come up after this presentation, please feel free to reach out to me as well as Sophia. But I think as we move forward here, this title slide, there's a lot in there, all right? But I think I'd like to just change the framework and contextualize things a bit better. So let's assume that everyone in this room had a condition called hydrocephalus. For the physician in the back of the room, he certainly knows what that means, and I know we have an OB physician here as well, but they clearly know what hydrocephalus is, and I'll get into the details of that a bit later. But let's assume all of us had hydrocephalus. And all of these patients for the last 70 plus years, they get treated with a shunt and a catheter that's implanted within the brain to kind of help in this area of the excess brain fluid that's causing the swelling of the brain. The sad thing is, within 30 days, 21% of those patients that have an implanted shunt will have to have revision surgery. Within 1 year, that number goes up to 40%. 2 years, it's 50%. So half of the room within 2 years is going to need some sort of revision surgery. And at 5 years, it goes up to 81%. That, to me, is a significant unmet medical need, and that is a problem. So what is Anuncia doing? Okay, this is a bit of a busy slide, but I think suffices to say, we're working on several different areas as it relates to how do we manage this cerebral spinal fluid in a more effective manner and then help these patients. Okay, so there's certainly a health impact when we look at hydrocephalus in and of itself. The technology impact that Anuncia is working on is a platform technology. So the ReFlow, the current product, is commercialized. I'll speak to that momentarily. But then also there's next generation products coming out for external ventricular catheters to be used in the neuro ICU setting, as well as a remote brain monitoring system that's down the road. But all of this is part of a strategic platform technology. The economic impact, when we start talking about hydrocephalus and EVD in and of themselves, it's enormous. Every surgery, $36,000 to $40,000. All right, so let's just think about that and contextualize that, and not even including the risk of infection or other comorbidities associated with having to come back in for some form of revision surgery. And I think in closing this slide, it's important to say that certainly we're in the hotbed. Great academic medical centers, great teaching institutions right in our backyard. And Arizona really is on the precipice of being a cornerstone of not only what Anuncia is working on, but also for the future. So let me define hydrocephalus for those in the crowd that are not familiar with this. Very simply, excess brain fluid causes the brain to swell, and this can lead to several different types of symptoms. Something as simple as a headache, okay? But if it's not treated, it can turn into nausea, vomiting. It can continue to develop and manifest upon itself, but if left untreated, it can certainly lead to death. So what causes this? The most common is what we call congenital hydrocephalus, but traumatic brain injury, we see this a lot with veterans as well. Brain bleeds, tumors, infections, and more recently, Billy Joel was diagnosed with normal pressure hydrocephalus. Again, very, very treatable, but I think when you have superstars that come up with these specific types of conditions, it is helpful to understand because they do raise awareness, and that's what's really important. As mentioned earlier, it's treated very simply with a ventricular shunt, a catheter that's implanted into the brain, and then eventually there's a tube that releases this fluid inside the abdomen area. Now, the other part of that from a hydrocephalus is when we talk about just standard neurosurgical procedures, There's very often swelling in the brain as well, and when patients are moved to the neurointensive care unit, they get what's called an extraventricular device, okay? And it's external, as you can see. There's the implanted catheter in the brain, but it doesn't flow to the abdomen. It flows externally, so hence the name EVD. The same problem occurs. You can see all of the associated clotting, blockage, whatever you want to call it, lack of patency for the catheters. And if this blocks in the ICU setting, the neurosurgeon has to come back in, they have to flush. If that doesn't work, then these patients are back into the OR again. So Anuncia has created the ReFlow platform, as I talked about, the ReFlow Mini. I'll get to that in a minute. That's the current commercialized product. And then in the ICU, we intend to launch the latter part of this year an EVD product. And then finally, in the future, a remote brain monitoring type of device. It's a wireless brain monitoring device that can look at intracranial pressure, but also look at certain biomarkers and flow within the brain. There's a lot of elasticity, which is associated with brain compliance, and it's very, very important to be able to monitor this. And this is important with conditions like Alzheimer's and the like. Here's a perfect example of what a catheter looks like when it's typically occluded. You can see a lot of this choroid plexus coagulation is the technical name of that, but at the bottom line is there's a lot of gunk in there that clogs up. And if they're not able to get rid of this, then this can cause significant problems and lead to revision surgery. I mentioned already about the statistics. This is data that's well known within the marketplace amongst whether it's pediatric or adult neurosurgeons, but as you can see on the right, shunt failures have almost been accepted as commonplace. There's been no real innovation in the last 70 years. We already talked about the cost, but what about the risk of infection? And then quite frankly, for the adolescent or the baby that has a shunt, I mean, think about just the burden associated with the physical or emotional burdens associated with the fact that there's always going to be in the back of your mind this issue of, is this always going to stay patent, and am I going to run into a problem? So the answer to this is the ReFlow Mini. The beauty of this is it's plug and play, and I love some of the buzzwords that the company's created. Brush your teeth, flush your brain. This is a very simple device. If you look on the right, the ventricular catheter is implanted, but this little silicone, it's almost like a little dome, okay? It gets implanted underneath the skin, above the skull. It's barely noticeable, but it's almost like a little plunger dome. And we say, flush this in the morning and flush this at night. You prophylactically flush this, and depending on the severity of your etiology, you may need to flush it 3 times a day. A very simple procedure. It adds only 4 minutes to the surgical procedure. We're currently in 35 hospitals across the US. I'll get to those momentarily. And then the beauty of this is it's very little time, and it gives whether it's the parent that's doing this for the infant, or if it's an adult, it gives them peace of mind to know, hey, am I getting that headache? Make sure that you flush this, all right? The key to this is evidence-based medicine, and I will get to that. But again, what's great about this is it's plug and play. It can be used with any shunt manufacturing device, any ventricular catheter that's on the market. It's only 4 minutes more for the surgeon. We're also launching an app that's going to be really helpful primarily for the parents that have the adolescents and the infants, because they have the ability to monitor very specifically. They can put the information in on the utilization, how are they prophylactically using the ReFlow Mini device, but it also can be shared with the clinician as well. As mentioned, we're in 35 hospitals across the US, some key hospitals highlighted here, all right? And I think what's really exciting about the company and what's new today that I'd like to share is my involvement has been more recent, but we're looking at some real-world data. We all know that evidence-based medicine trumps everything, and all of us that are in this business know that you have to have either a prospective randomized clinical trial, or you better have some sort of real-world evidence that you can go toe-to-toe with a pediatric neurosurgeon. Well, the good news is that while they don't have that prospective randomized placebo-controlled trial, they do actually have real-world data in patients, and we have over 60 patients where we're looking at one-year data that's going to be announced at the World Hydrocephalus Congress in Brazil this July. So the company is really focused on coalescing around this new data that we intend to release. There's going to be a pretty robust relaunch associated with this, because this will finally give the clinicians the answer that they've been asking for. We can basically state to them that we will see a greater than 50% reduction in revision surgery at year one. I mean, that's not just like 0.5% or 1% or 2% when we saw with the thrombolytic agents of streptokinase to TPA. This is a 50+% reduction in revision surgery at year one. And when this gets published, then I think it gives the company that's right in your backyard in Scottsdale, manufactured here in Phoenix, the ability to go toe-to-toe and make this a standard of care in the neurological setting. So I'll close with a couple stories, and I think it's always great, and to Joan's point, bringing it back to the patient. All right, so what we see here, called out on the right, 2 adolescent patients, both Sutton and Maury. All right, Sutton was a frequent flyer, constantly coming back for revision surgeries. Parents are like, this is absurd. Something has to change. So Sutton ended up getting a ReFlow. He's been 5 years revision-free surgery. All right, Maury, similar story, 3 years revision-free, okay? Both of them had the ReFlow. So I think whether it's anecdotal information or not, that certainly convinced those neurosurgeons, hey, this is working, right? Evidence-based medicine, real-world evidence-based medicine. Unfortunately, Jimmy, 30 revision surgeries, 30 by his 14th birthday, okay? On his 14th birthday, has headaches, but he's so excited, he's hanging out with his buddies, okay? And he went to sleep that night and didn't wake up, okay? He didn't have the ReFlow. Now, can we say unequivocally that the ReFlow would have saved his life? Who knows? But 30 revision surgeries, my opinion is, let's go back to that neurosurgeon that did the 30th revision surgery and say, what were you thinking? Here's a product that's available to you. What more do you have to lose, right? It's one patient at a time, right? But by that one patient simply preventing any revision surgery, less risk of infection and everything associated with it, that's what we're all about. It's improving the quality of life for these patients. And I think Anuncia, I congratulate them because they're really on the cusp of a very exciting transition as a company as it's evolving in the commercial world. But this real-world data, and coupled with other real-world data evidence, is going to be really, really significant catalyst for the growth of the company in the future. So we are very active with finding additional distributors amongst the US, so that would be my ask. So if you know of any additional distributors, we have a good portion of the US covered, but I think it's important that we make sure that we get all of the white space in every area covered before we have this robust relaunch that we intend to do sometime this summer. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, glad to answer, or you can reach out to Sophia. Thank you.